Chapter 3. Transgression. This is the freedom of the void which rises to a passion and takes shape in the world. While still remaining theoretical, it takes shape in the Hindu fanaticism of pure contemplation, but when it turns to actual practice, it takes shape in religion and politics alike as the fanaticism of destruction, the destruction of the whole subsisting social order, as the elimination of individuals who are objects of suspicion to any social order, and the annihilation of any organization which tries to rise anew from the ruins. Hegel. The Republic being permanently menaced from the outside by the despots surrounding it, the means to its preservation cannot be imagined as moral means, for the Republic will preserve itself only by war, and nothing is less moral than war. I ask how one will be able to demonstrate that in a state rendered immoral by its obligations, it is essential that the individual be moral. I will go further. It is a very good thing he is not. The Greek lawgivers perfectly appreciated the capital necessity of corrupting the member citizens in order that, their moral dissolution coming into conflict with the establishment and its values, there would result the insurrection that is always indispensable to a political system of perfect happiness, which, like republican government, must necessarily excite the hatred and envy of all its foreign neighbors. Insurrection, thought these sage legislators, is not at all a moral condition. However, it has got to be a republic's permanent condition. Hence it would be no less absurd than dangerous to require that those who are to ensure the perpetual immoral subversion of the established order themselves be moral beings. For the state of a moral man is one of tranquility and peace. The state of an immoral man is one of perpetual unrest, that pushes him to, and identifies him with, the necessary insurrection in which the republican must always keep the government of which he is a member. The Marquis de Sade. We have no true pleasure except in expending uselessly, as if a wound opens in us. Bataille. The most unavowable aspects of our pleasures connect us the most solidly. Bataille. It has often been suggested, not least by Sartre, that Bataille replaces dialectic in revolution with the paralyzed revolt of transgression. It is transgression that opens the way to tragic communication, the exaltation in the utter immolation of order that consummates and ruins humanity in a sacrifice without limits. Bataille is a philosopher not of indifference, but of evil, of an evil that will always be the name for those processes that flagrantly violate all human utility, all accumulative reason, all stability, and all sense. He considers Nietzsche to have amply demonstrated that the criteria of the good, self-identity, permanence, benevolence, and transcendent individuality, are ultimately rooted in the preservative impulses of a peculiarly sordid, inert, and cowardly species of animals. Despite his pseudo-sovereignty, the Occidental God, as the guarantor of the good, has always been the ideal instrument of human reactivity, the numbingly anti-experimental principle of utilitarian calculus. To defy God, in a celebration of evil, is to threaten mankind with adventures that they have been determined to outlaw. The Kantian cultural revolution is associated with a deepened usage of juridical discourse in philosophy. Transcendental philosophy equates knowing with legislation, displacing the previously dominant axis of argumentation, extended between skepticism and belief, with one organized in terms of legitimacy and illegitimacy. The sense of logic, for example, undergoes a massive, if largely subterranean, shift, from evident truth to necessary rule. The metaphysical errors which Kant critiques are formally described as crimes, and more specifically as violations of rights. The subject is divided into faculties with strictly demarcated domains of legitimate sovereignty, beyond which their exercise is a transgression. Most important to Kant are the reciprocal injustices of reason and understanding, with his first critique detailing the trespasses of reason upon the understanding, or theory, and the second critique defending reason against theoretical incursions into its proper domain, that of moral legislation. The lower faculties of sensation, and to a lesser extent imagination, are of more indirect concern, since they are branded as incorrigible reprobates, corrupted by their insinuation into the swamp of the body. Kant initiated the modern tradition of insidious theism by shielding God from theoretical investigation, while maintaining the moral necessity of his existence. God was exiled into a space of pure practical reason, simultaneously protected against intellectual transgression and underwriting moral law. In his critique of judgment, Kant describes the moral impossibility of a world without God and the fate of one attempting to live according to it in the following terms. Deceit, violence, and envy will always be rife around him, although he himself is honest, peaceable, and benevolent. And the other righteous men he meets in the world, no matter how deserving they may be of happiness, will be subjected by nature, which takes no heed of such deserts, to all the evils of want, disease, and untimely death, just as are the other animals of the earth. And so it will continue to be until one wide grave engulfs them all, just and unjust, there is no distinction in the grave, and hurls them back into the abyss of the aimless chaos of matter from which they were taken, that they were able to believe themselves the final end of creation. This passage might be from Sade's Justine, The Misfortunes of Virtue, reminding us that the age of Kant is tangled with that of Sade, a writer who explored the exacerbation of transgression rather than its juridical resolution. Where Kant consolidated the modern pact between philosophy and the state, Sade fused literature with crime in the dungeons of both old and new regimes. Sade insisted upon reasoning about God, repeating original sin, but even after obliterating him with a blizzard of theoretical discourse, his hunger for atheological aggression remained insatiable. Sade does not negotiate with God or the state, but to ceaselessly resist their possibility. Accordingly, his political pamphlets do not appeal for improved institutions, but only for the restless vigilance of armed masses in the streets. Abstract negation or negative freedom are Hegel's expressions for this sterilizing resistance, which erases the position of the subject. It could equally be described as real death. Bataille's engagement with Sade is prolonged and intense, but also sporadic, consisting of articles and essays which never reach the peak of intimacy characterizing Sur Nietzsche. After Nietzsche, however, it is Sade who comes closest to such an intimacy, and, like Nietzsche, accompanies Bataille throughout the entire length of his textual voyage, with an intellectual solidarity so great that it touches upon a complete erasure of distinction. Sade plays an important role in luring Bataille's discussion of eroticism into its abyssal nonsense, because his writing is baked to charcoal in the sacred. No writer fathoms more profoundly the utter inutility of the erotic impulse, nor its sacrilegious and insurrectionary fury. Sade consecrated interminable works to the affirmation of unacceptable values. According to him, life is the search for pleasure, and pleasure is proportional to the destruction of life. In other words, life attains the highest degree of intensity in a monstrous negation of its principle. The orgies, massacres, and blasphemies of the Sadean text knit almost seamlessly onto Bataille's obsession with an intolerable sacrificial wastage vomited into the suppurating cavity of the divine. Bataille finds in these texts the excessive negation of the principle upon which life rests, a pitch of voluptuary intensity at which eroticism passes unreservedly into the sacred. Compared to the Sade interpretations of Blanchot, for instance, despite complex affinities and intertextual communications, there is a ravine as great as any that could be imagined, an incommensurability of thought insinuated into a common and inevitable vocabulary. Negation, crime, atheism, revolt, are words that Bataille associates with a heterogeneity so repugnant to elevated thought that its repression must be presupposed in the origination of any possible speculation, whereas for Blanchot, these are words that belong to reason itself, at least from the moment that it is permitted to find itself in the solitude of literature. It is only our inertia and our hypocrisy, as Blanchot suggests, with an insidious power, that protect us from the latent fury of reason. Unlike Blanchot, Bataille does not emphasize the ruthless consistency of Enlightenment rationalism in Sade's writings, even though he acknowledges that Sade seems to have been the most consequential representative of 18th century French materialism. By definition, excess is external to reason, he remarks in one discussion of Sade, and it is an incitement to criminality rather than an exultant rationality that he detects in passages such as this. Atheism is the one system of all those prone to reason. As we gradually proceeded to our enlightenment, we came more and more to feel that, motion being inherent in matter, the prime mover existed only as an illusion, and that all that exists having to be in motion, the motor was useless. We sensed that this chimerical divinity, prudently invented by the earliest legislators, was, in their hands, simply one more means to enthrall us, and that, reserving unto themselves the right to make the phantom speak, they knew very well how to get him to say nothing, but what would shore up the preposterous laws whereby they declared they served us. Either believe in God and adore him, or disbelieve and demobilize, for it is as senseless to rage against omnipotence as inexistence. Thus it is that Sade's opponents take the two strands of his defiance to be mutually contradicting, to cancel each other, and, once aufhebt, expressing either a futile rage flung into the void, or a desperate plea for reconciliation. Blasphemy is never logical. If an omnipotent God exists, the blasphemer can only be damaging himself by insulting him. If he does not exist, there is no one there to insult, writes Hayman. After all, how can one revolt against a fiction? It is perhaps a symptom of fixation or regression, an unresolved infantilism in any case, for affect to be detached so completely from an acknowledged reality. In a world divided between theistic enthusiasts and secularist depressives, there is little patience for the atheist who nurtures a passionate hatred for God. The mixture of naturalism and blasphemy that characterizes the Sadean text occupies the space of our blindness, to which Bataille's writings are not unreasonably assimilated. If there is contradiction here, it is one that is coextensive with the unconscious, the consequence of a revolt incommensurate with the ontological weight of its object. That God has wrought such loathsomeness without even having existed only exacerbates the hatred pitched against him. An atheism that does not hunger for God's blood is an inanity, and the anemic feebleness of secular rationalism has so little appeal that it approximates to an argument for his existence. What is suggested by the Sadean furore is that anyone who does not exult at the thought of driving nails through the limbs of the Nazarene is something less than an atheist, merely a disappointed slave. Amongst the diseases Bataille shares with Nietzsche is the insistence that the death of God is not an epistemic conviction, but a crime. It is no less worthy of cathedrals than the tyrant it abolished, and whose grave it continues to desecrate. Indeed, such new cathedrals are inextricable from the unholy festivities of desecration which resound through them, as the texts of Sade, Nietzsche, and Bataille themselves illustrate. The illimitable criminality driving Bataille's writings provokes no hint of repentance within it, but that does not make him a pagan, which is to say, juridically, unfit to plead. Lacking the slightest interest in justification, innocence is not an aspiration he nourishes. He is closer to Satan than to Pan, propelled by a defiant culpability. Bataille is altogether too morbid to be a pagan. And yet, despite what is in part a reactive relation to Christianity, the thought of necessary crime is an interpretation of the tragic and of hubris. Tragic fate is the necessity that the forbidden happen, and happen as the forbidden. Quoting what he takes to be a latent popular maxim, Bataille writes that the prohibition is there to be violated. He associates this subterranean collective insight with an indifference to logic at the root of social regulation, since the violation committed is not of a nature to suppress the possibility and the sense of the emotion opposed to it. It is even the justification and the source. One of his formulae for this effective paradox is the violation of prohibition according to a rule. Such a violation is not so much provoked by prohibition as it is compelled by an inexorable process to which prohibition is a response. This thought is commonly expressed within his writings in terms of the economic inevitability of evil, and also occasionally as the eruption of transgression. As an overt theme, transgression is nothing like as dominant within Bataille's writings as is often suggested, and it is only with extraordinary arbitrariness that he can be described as a philosopher of transgression. If it were not for the sustained discussion to be found in eroticism, it is unlikely that this term would have come to be read as anything more than the marginal elaboration of a more basic problem, that of expenditure, consumption, or sacrifice. Nevertheless, criminal variations analogous to transgressions are prolifically distributed throughout his writings and lend themselves, with apparent ease, to a measure of formulation. In a broadly Nietzschean fashion, Bataille understands law as the imperative to the preservation of discrete being. Law summarizes conditions of existence and shares its arbitrariness with the survival of the human race. The civility of a legal existence is that of an unconditional one, of existence for its own sake, involving the submission of consumption to its reproduction, and eventually to its complete normative suppression within an obsessional productivism. The word Bataille usually employs to mark the preserve of law is discontinuity, which is broadly synonymous with transcendence. Bataille's thought of discontinuity is more intricate than his fluent deployment of the word might indicate. It is the condition for transcendent illusion or ideality, and precisely for this reason it cannot be grasped by a transcendent apparatus, by the interknitted series of conceptions involving negation, logical distinction, simple disjunction, essential difference, etc. Discontinuity is not ontologically grounded, in the fashion of a Leibnizian monad, for instance, but positively fabricated in the same process that amasses resources for its disposal. Accumulation does not presuppose a subject or individual, but rather founds one. This is because any possible self, or relative isolation, is only ever precipitated as a precarious digression within a general economy, perpetually renegotiated across the scale of energy flows. The relative autonomy of the organism is not an ontological given, but a material achievement which, even at its apex, remains quite incommensurable with the notion of an individual's soul or personality. It is in large part because death attests so strongly to this fact that theology has monotonously demanded its systematic effacement. Because isolation is, in an abnormal sense, quantitative, quantity cannot be conceived arithmetically on the basis of discretion. Base, general, or solar economics, which are amongst Bataille's names for economics at the level of emergent discontinuities, cannot be organized by any prior conceptual matrix. The distinctions between quantity, quality, degree, kind, analog, digital, etc., which typically manage economic thought, are all dependent upon the prior acceptance of discontinuity or derivative articulation. It is obvious that the economics or energetics, which Bataille associates with base cosmology, cannot be identified with any kind of physicalistic theory, since the logical and mathematical concepts underlying any such theory are devastated by the radical interrogation of simple difference. With the operation of a sufficiently delicate materialist apparatus, general economy can in large measure be thought, but in the end its fragmentary and ironic character stems from a delirial genesis in the violation of articulate lucidity. The solar source of all terrestrial resources commits them to an abysmal generosity, which Bataille calls glory. This is perhaps best understood as a contagious profligacy, according to which all inhibition, accumulation, and reservation is destined to fail. The infrastructure of the terrestrial process inheres in the obstructive character of the earth, in its mere bulk as a momentary arrest of solar energy flows, which lends itself to hypostasization. When the silting up of energy upon the surface of the planet is interpreted by its complex consequences as rigid utility, a productivist civilization is initiated, whose culture involves a history of ontology and a moral order. Systemic limits to growth require that the inevitable recommencement of the solar trajectory scorches jagged perforations through such civilizations. The resultant ruptures cannot be securely assimilated to a metasocial homeostatic mechanism because they have an immoderate epidemic tendency. Bataille writes of the virulence of death. Expenditure is irreducibly ruinous because it is not merely useless, but also contagious. Nothing is more infectious than the passion for collapse. Predominant amongst the incendiary and epidemic gashes which contravene the interests of mankind are eroticism, base religion, inutile criminality, and war. In The Accursed Share, Bataille outlines a number of social responses to the unsublatable wave of senseless wastage welling up beneath human endeavor, which he draws from a variety of cultures and epochs. These include the potlatch of the subarctic tribes, the sacrificial cult of the Aztecs, the monastic extravagance of the Tibetans, the martial ardor of Islam, and the architectural debauch of hegemonic Catholicism. Reform Christianity alone, attuned to the emergent bourgeois order, is based upon a relentless refusal of sumptuary consumption. It is with Protestantism that theology accomplishes itself in the thoroughgoing rationalization of religion, marking the ideological triumph of the good and propelling humanity into unprecedented extremities of affluence and catastrophe. It is also with Protestantism that the transgressive outlets of society are deritualized and exposed to effective condemnation, a tendency which leads to the terrible exhibitions of atrocity associated with the writings of the Marquis de Sade at the end of the 18th century, anticipated already, over 3 centuries before, with the life of Gilles de Rais. Bataille describes his 1959 study of Gilles de Rais as a tragedy, and its subject as a sacred monster who owed his enduring glory to his crimes. The bare facts are quite rapidly outlined. Gilles de Rais was born towards the end of the year 1404, inheriting the fortune, name, and arms of Rais due to a complicated dynastic intrigue involving his parents Guy de Laval and Marie de Craon. Even by the standards of his times and rank, de Rais dissipated vast tranches of his wealth with abnormal extravagance. In Bataille's words, he liquidated an immense fortune without reckoning. At the Battle of Orléans, he fought alongside Joan d'Arc, acquiring renown as a truly valiant knight-in-arms, which survived right up to the point of his condemnation to infamy. It has been suggested that the two warriors were friends, but Bataille expresses reservations about this hypothesis. On the 30th of May, 1431, Jeanne d'Arc was burned by the English. In the years 1432-3, de Rais began to murder children. He preferred victims were males, with an average age of 11 years, although there was occasional variation in sex and considerable variation in age. At least 35 murders are well established, although the number was almost certainly a great deal higher. The figures suggested at his trial ranged up to 200. In a somewhat inelegant passage from this study, Bataille recapitulates the quasi-Weberian general economic background to his researches. We accumulate wealth in the prospect of a continual expansion, But in societies different from ours, the prevalent principle was the contrary one of wasting or losing wealth, of giving or destroying it. Accumulated wealth has the same sense as work. Wealth wasted or destroyed in tribal potlatch has the contrary sense of play. Accumulated wealth has nothing but a subordinate value, but wealth that is wasted or destroyed has, to the eyes of those who waste it or destroy it, a sovereign value. It serves nothing ulterior, only this wastage itself, or this fascinating destruction, its present sense. Its wastage, or the gift that one makes of it, is its final reason for being, and it is due to this that its sense is not able to be put off, and must be in the instant. But it is consumed in that instant. This can be magnificent. Those who know how to appreciate consumption are dazzled, but nothing remains of it. The tragedy of de Rais, which Bataille extends to the nobility as a whole, was that of living the transition from sumptuary to rational sociality. He was dedicated by birth to the reckless militarism of the French aristocracy, which Bataille summarizes in the formula, "In the same way that the man without privilege is reduced to a worker, the one who is privileged must wage war." He is emphatic on this point. The feudal world is not able to be separated from the lack of measure, des mesures, which is the principle of wars. And also, primitively, war seems to be a luxury. That honor and prestige is incommensurable with the calculations of utility is an insistent theme in Bataille's work, as pertinent to the interpretation of potlatch amongst the Tlingit as to the blood hunger and extravagance of Europe's medieval nobility. The context of Christianity and courtly love should not mislead us here. The paradox of the Middle Ages demanded that the warrior elite did not speak the language of force in combat. Their mode of speech was often sickly sweet, but we shouldn't fool ourselves. The goodwill of the ancient French was a cynical lie. Even the poetry that the nobles of the 14th and 16th centuries affected to love was, in every sense, a deception. Before everything, the great lords loved war. Their attitude differed little from that of the German berserkers, whose dreams were dominated by horrors and slaughter. The feudal aristocracy held open a wound in the social body, through which excess production was hemorrhaged into utter loss. In part, this wastage was accomplished by the hypertrophic luxuriance of their leisured and parasitic existence, which echoed that of the church, but more important was the ceaseless ebb and flow of military confrontation into which life and treasure could be poured without limit. De Rais embraced this dark heart of the feudal world with peculiar ardor. Bataille writes of his mad incarnation of the spirit of feudalism, which, in all of its movement, proceeded from the games that the berserkers played. He was tethered to war by an affinity that succeeded in marking out a taste for cruel voluptuosities. He had no place in the world, if not the one that war gave him. He continues, "Such wars required intoxication. They required the vertigo and the giddiness of those that birth had consecrated to them. War precipitated its elect into assaults, or suffocated them in dark obsessions." During the 14th and 15th centuries, the epoch of feudal warfaring reached a crescendo, due to exactly the same processes that were leading to its utilitarian reconstruction. Power was being steadily centralized in the hands of the monarchy, and changes in military technology effected a gradual shift in the social composition of the military apparatus. In particular, Bataille points to the way in which the development of archery supplanted the dominant role of heavy cavalry, and to the fact that with the increasing importance of arrows and pikes came an accentuation of military discipline. War became increasingly rationalized and subjected to scientific direction. This evolution was not rapid, but de Rais was personally touched by it. The Battle of Lagny in 1432 was the last to plunge him into the heat of conflict, after which his position as a Marshal of France, which he had occupied since July 1429, detached him from the military cutting edge. Bataille's interpretation of these tendencies is emphatic. At the instant where royal politics and intelligence alters, The feudal world no longer exists. Neither intelligence nor calculation is noble. It is not noble to calculate, not even to reflect, and no philosopher has been able to incarnate the essence of nobility. War is progressively disinvested by the voluptuary movement passing through the nobility, increasingly becoming an instrument of rational statecraft, calculatively manipulated by the sovereign. A process was underway that would lead eventually to the tightly regimented military machines of Renaissance Europe, led by professional officers, and directed operationally in accordance with political pragmatics. Bataille considers this transition from warlord to prince to be crucial in de Rais' case. To the eyes of Gilles, war is a game, but that view becomes less and less true, to the extent that it ceases to predominate even amongst the privileged. Increasingly, therefore, war becomes a general misfortune. At the same time, it becomes the work of a great number. The general situation deteriorates. It becomes more complex, the misfortune even reaching the privileged, who become ever less avid for war and for games, seeing in the end that the moment has come to lend space to problems of reason. Where the church erected cathedrals in a disfigured celebration of the death of God, the nobility built fortresses to glorify and to accentuate the economy of war. Their fortresses were tumours of aggressive autonomy, hard membranes correlative with an acute disequilibrium of force. Within the fortress, social excess is concentrated to its maximum tension, before being siphoned off into the furious wastage of the battlefield. It was into his fortresses that de Rais retreated, withdrawing from a society in which he had become nothing, in order to bury himself in darkness and atrocity. The children of the surrounding areas disappeared into these fortresses, in the same way that the surplus production of the local peasantry had always done, except now the focus of consumption had ceased to be the exterior social spectacle of colliding armies, involuting instead into a sequence of secret killings. Rather than a staging post for excess, the heart of the fortress became its terminus, the site of a hidden and unholy participation in the annihilating veracity which Bataille calls the solar anus, or the black sun. Perhaps one short passage will suffice in lieu of detailing these crimes. Early in his study, Bataille remarks, "His crimes responded to the immense disorder which inflamed him, and in which he was lost. We even know, by means of the criminal's confession, which the scribes of the court copied down whilst listening to him, that it was not pleasure that was essential. Certainly he sat astride the chest of the victim, and in that fashion, playing with himself, ce mignon, he would spill his sperm upon the dying one. But what was important to him was less sexual enjoyment than the vision of death at work. He loved to look, opening a body, cutting a throat, detaching limbs. He loved the sight of blood." Among the problematic features of this passage is the fact that it involves an oxymoron in the terms of Bataille's writings, because the prevailing sense of work in these texts is exactly that of a resistance to death. He describes work as the process that binds energy into the form of the resource or utile object, inhibiting its tendency to dissipation. This difficulty is exacerbated by the central role allocated to vision in Gilles's atrocities. Work constrains the slippage towards death, but it conspires with visibility. Scopic representation and utility are mutually sustained by objectivity, which Bataille, unlike Kant, understands as transcendence. The crystallization of things from out of the continuum of immanent flow. The ultimate inanity of Gilles's aberration is attested by the fact that it is not the taste or smell of death that he seeks, but its sight. Seeking itself is the scopic form of craving. Gilles's passion is sublime, in that it is an attempt to delect in death, noumenon, and like Kant's sublime, it requires a safe place for its possibility, which in both cases is that of representation as such. Of all sensory modalities, vision is the coldest and most distant, the one most conducive to the idealist illusions which dematerialize irritation and precipitate the phantasm of autonomous subjectivity. Vision is so pregnant with incipient rationalization that it tends to involve an inherent negative reflex, exaggerating its difference from touch. This is why scopophiliac investments are not libidinal tropisms like any other, but compromises, coaxing drives into the domesticated state associated with representation, and by this means constraining them to teleology. For desire to occupy the schema of approximation to a condition that is represented as its telos is consequential upon the visualization of its activating irritation. Impulse is thus lured into the trap of negativity, aspiration, and dependence upon the reality principle, exactly the complex which Bataille summarizes consistently as transcendence. I hope that it is not mere timidity on my part that leads to this reservation. It would be the shoddiest domestication to suggest that some theoretical comfort were possible here. After all, it is certainly not Rais' ferocity that inhibits his full complicity with the sun. If transgression appears as the negation of law, it is only because law is coextensive with the unachievable negation of solar flow, just as base matter is deemed negative because it exhibits no resistance to death. Nevertheless, insofar as crime receives its formulation in the courtroom, it is quite properly understood as a speculative development of legality, as Hegel demonstrates so meticulously in his Philosophy of Right. Such an apprehension of crime through the optic of the trial is no merely empirical projection, but a bias rooted in the juridical advantage of existence. Death has no representatives, which is to say that transgression has no subject. There is only the sad wreck who Nietzsche calls the pale criminal. De Rais, at his trial, for instance, terrified of Satan, separated from his crimes by an unnavigable gulf of oblivion. The truth of transgression, at once utterly simple and yet ungraspable, is that evil does not survive to be judged. Transgression is not mere criminality, insofar as this latter involves private utility, or the occupation by a subject of the site of proscribed action. It is rather the effective genealogy of law, operating at a level of community more basic than the social order, which is simultaneous with legality. Transgression is only judged as such in the course of a regression to a prehistorical option, which was decided by the institution of justice. At this point, the sedimentation of energy upon the crust of the earth becomes normatively reinforced by an affirmation of social persistence. Nietzsche explores exactly this issue in section 9 of the second essay of his Genealogy of Morals, in which he describes the primitive response to transgression. Punishment at this level of civilization is simply a copy, a mimesis, of the normal attitude toward a hated, disarmed, prostrated enemy, who has lost not only every right and protection, but all hope of quarter as well. It is thus the rites of war and the victory celebration of the Vae Victis, in all their mercilessness and cruelty, which explains why it is that war itself, including the warlike sacrificial cult, has provided all the forms that punishment has assumed throughout history. War is irreducibly alien to a collision of rights, so that it is war that bears down on the one who violates right as such. Transgression is not a misdemeanor, even if this is the necessary form of its social interpretation. It is rather a solar barbarism resonant with that of the berserkers, and of all those who fathom an abysmal inhumanity on the battlefield. No tragedy without an Agamemnon, or some other mad beast of war, whose nemesis preempts the discourse of the juridical institution, and whose death is thus marked by a peculiar intimacy. Bataille writes, "Tragedy is the impotence of reason." This does not signify that tragedy has rights against reason. In truth, it is not possible for a right to belong to something contrary to reason, for how could a right be opposed to reason? Human violence, however, which has the power to go against reason, is tragic and must, if possible, be suppressed. At least it cannot be ignored or despised. It is in speaking of Gilles de Rais that I come to say this, for he differs from all those for whom crime is a personal matter. The crimes of Gilles de Rais are those of the world in which they are committed, and these ripped throats are exposed by the convulsive movements of such a world. However difficult or repellent the matter at stake might be, we can scarcely avoid the search for the sense of transgression, which is the requirement of relating it to the Kantianism which forms our philosophical actuality. It is because Kant completes the understanding of the difference between laws and cases that his involvement is already implicit in any attempt to judge crimes. Hegel will, of course, suggest that to merely understand justice is still insufficient, and that it remains to justify it. Our world recoils from meaningless crime even more forcefully than Rais, since modernity is in large part the necessity that death testifies, even if it is in the guise of a problematic concept, serving as a limit to the understanding. Knowing must be articulated with death, and the philosophical vocabulary of the modern age is adapted to this task. Examples including limit, Aufhebung, indifference, difference, etc. Bataille locates the word sacrifice in this series, in which its specific function is to mark the immanent or base continuity between death and knowing, a continuity which is correlative to the failure of transcendence, and is here described as tragedy or the impotence of reason. Tragedy, or the repulsion of discursive appropriation from death, affects a sporadic textual disruption whenever it is registered, since, although the productive usage of language ceases, words still jut out beyond the splinter fringe of discourse, tracking a positive death lip as it teeters into collapse. This ragged edge of Bataille's writing marks a disappearing base impulse, communicating with the virological reservoir of violated scription, which he calls a holocaust of words. Poetry, laughter, and filth have no meaning. They are unable to commensurate to the defense of a juridical subject, nor can they be justified, affirmed, or protected. Rimbaud's ruthless abandonment of poetry has a numbing appropriateness. The name Bataille could easily mislead us. It might seem, for instance, as if transgression had a defense, a voice, as if evil could be a praxis or a cause. It is in such ways that senseless loss might be neutralized within rationality. There are certainly good reasons for seeking to reconstruct some such Bataille. It is an unfortunate fact that such projects inevitably fail, not because of some death of the author, but because of the death that is precisely not that of the author or of anybody else. Bataille's irrelevance is due to a death denuded of all sophistical ornamentation, a death that is the vortex of evil, and as such sufficiently incommensurate with his discourse to be exiled to the impossible, only puncturing his text as a dark shaft of inavowable impersonality. Literature is itself a crime. Law is not exercised upon inert beings, but only upon those whose cooperation can be claimed. Obedience is always at least minimally active. This is why the recipient of a commandment is characterized as an agent, and why lawfulness attests to an implicit sovereignty. Docility in respect of the law is quite different from a surrender, in exactly the way that moralists are different from mystics. Surrender is a deeper evil than any possible action. The very principle of action is an acceptance of justice and responsibility, and any act is, as such, an amelioration of crime, expressing defiance within the syntax of redemption. In stark comparison with action, surrender gnaws away the conditions for salvation. Giving itself up to a wave of erasure, the agent dies in the cosmic reservoir of crime. Beyond the agentic pact with Satan lies an irreparable dissolution into forces of darkness, apart from which there is no ecstasy. Surrender is not a submission to an alien agency, devotion to God, but a surrender of agency in general. It is not any kind of consigning of oneself over to another, return to the Father, but utter abandonment of self, a dereliction of duty which aggresses against one's birth. Bataille's reading of Rais is a discourse on evil, or a philosophy of the sublime, and not a poem, a sacrificial denudation, or an effectuation of death. It cannot be sufficiently stressed that evil is never on trial. The same bedrock of human docility that in Rais generates the complex of separations between self and activity, self and victim, culpability and death, is also at work in Bataille's text, producing equivalent transcendent effects. Just as with Rais's pact with the devil, his association with Bataille is contractual, socialized, respectful of identities and norms. It is in accordance with a reconstructive or discursive exigency that a visual theme and the philosophical schema of sublimity, along with the proper names Gilles de Rais and Georges Bataille, line up in a testament to transgression. Such reportage might be the ape of glory, but it would be difficult to maintain that it was alien to Rais's case, or that his superstition, vanity, and voyeurism did not work to transform him into a recognizable figure, schematizing him into our world. Rais cannot be innocently resuscitated on the outside of modernity, as if representation was a pure transcendence, qualified to judge the specificity of a cumulative sociality. To the extent that we accommodate ourselves to the good, that which is wretched, reserved, and confessional about Rais belongs also to us.